So Brad was coming to the ward and was being welcomed. And one Sunday, as he was passing by my door, I called him in. And I knew he had maybe 6 months left to live. So I said, Brad, have you ever thought about going to the temple? He said, of course, he said. I thought about it, but he said, I know that's not possible. I said, maybe it is. He said, what do you mean? I said, well, let me ask you. I'm going to read you the questions that I would ask you if you were going to the temple, and I don't want you to answer them. I just want you to listen to them and think about them. So he did. And a couple of months later, I said, have you thought about those questions? And he said, yeah. And he said, I'm ready. So he came and I interviewed him. And I said, and Patrick's okay with this? He said, yeah. And knowing that Patrick loved him and was taking care of him in his illness, I knew that it was right for them to continue living together and for me to ask those questions. So I asked the questions and I wrote him out a temple recommend. He went to see the stake president, and President Howard Anderson, who was a great stake president, signed the recommend. And on a particular day, Brad's family came, and we went to the temple. I was his escort. And what I didn't know as we were going through the temple is that someone had called the temple president that morning and said, someone's going through your temple today that doesn't deserve to do that. And he said, why? And he said, well, because he's gay and he's living with his gay partner. So the mission president didn't know much about this. He called President Anderson and said, what's the story here? And President Anderson said, President, that man has been interviewed by his bishop and found worthy, interviewed by me and found worthy. And I would like the name of the man who called you, because I want to call his bishop and his stake president and tell them that they should have a counsel on somebody who is messing in things that he has no business doing. Anyway, it was a beautiful experience to be in the temple with Brad, and afterwards we had a dinner, a lunch, and his family was there and Patrick was there. And it was just one of those experiences in which it seemed everything worked well to such a beautiful ending. And Patrick took care of Brad until Brad passed away. But that experience taught me a lot of things. It taught me what it means to be not someone who lives by the letter of the law, but someone who looks beyond that in particular instances. In fact, the first 6 months I was bishop, I was worried that I wasn't going to be consistent, and then I started worrying that I would be, because there were just so many instances in which one had to make a judgment. And these Latter-day Saints, these faithful, good people, taught me so much about what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be a Latter-day Saint. The gay and lesbian members of my ward really taught me how to be a minister. But there were so many things about that ward and about that experience that I will always treasure. Ruth was just wonderful because so many of the kids came to our house. Kids, I call them, the members of the ward came to our house. We had weddings there. We had wedding receptions. We had parties of all kinds. We had lots of dinners and special events from members of involved members of the ward. So it was a wonderful experience. When that period ended, earlier when I was at UCLA and I took early retirement around this time, toward the end of being a bishop. I was bishop from 86 to 92, I believe, somewhere in that neighborhood. I had earlier, when I was at UCLA, I'd been invited by the Soviet Department of Education to come to the Soviet Union and to investigate the possibility of doing some joint programs. So 4 or 5 of us from UCLA, and including Ruth, went to Moscow and St. Petersburg and to meet with educators and to explore the possibility of joint programs. It was a very interesting experience to be in the Soviet Union, to be in Russia, to be in these 2 great cities, because I had, like many people growing up during the Cold War, I had stereotypical ideas and attitudes toward them. And then I realized that wherever you are, these are people who are just like everyone else in the world in many ways, except they lived under a repressive regime and had probably as many outmoded ideas about my country as I had about theirs. Anyway, it was a very interesting experience to be there. And then what was really interesting is that Ruth and I, after I took early retirement, we were trying to decide what we were going to do. And I was torn, because if I had stayed at UCLA, I would have had a very handsome retirement. But for some reason, I felt I just didn't want to stay and do the same thing that I wanted to have, and Ruth too. We wanted to have new adventures, and so we were driving north to see our daughter Jenny one weekend, coming up to see her, and we had an automobile accident that was quite serious, in which Ruth and I were both injured, and I was taken by ambulance to the UCLA emergency room where there were some operations performed. Ruth had a broken clavicle and a broken left arm, and as we were recovering at home after the operation, she was reading the Ensign, the church magazine, and reading about the church wanting senior missionaries. And so she said, "Why don't we do that?" I said, "Great, let's do it." So we put in our papers to be called on a mission, and we were called to the St. Petersburg, Russia mission of the church, and left in November of 1992 to go to what we thought would be a period of 6 months, or excuse me, of 18 months. That's the minimum time, or the minimum time that senior missionaries went. So we went for 18 months. And then when we were there, only a few months, when they established a new mission called the Baltic States Mission, which included Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, and Kaliningrad. And so we ended up staying. We were there for almost 4 years. And when the Baltic States Mission opened, in fact, when it was part of the St. Petersburg Russia mission, there were no members of the Mormon Church in the entire country. So we had this new country all to ourselves, and a great adventure ahead of us. And it really was a great adventure. I mean, it was so fascinating to live in a country that had been under a communism, and to see how that society was so repressed in so many ways and so controlled. There were just vestiges of it everywhere. But in Lithuania was one of the countries that had a resistance to the Soviets well into the middle of the century, beyond the middle of the century, actually. A group of forest brothers, as they called them, continuing to fight the Soviets until they were finally defeated. But there was a real spirit of resistance among the Lithuanian people. They're very proud people. Lithuanian kingdom goes back, at one point it was so large it spread from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, and an extremely patriotic in terms of their own heritage. So it was complete kind of tabula rasa. We had this whole country to ourselves. We could practically do what we wanted. The president of the mission came from St. Petersburg in December of '92, and we met with them, and we began talking to people about the gospel. We began eventually holding little services in our apartment. We began teaching in English in the public schools, and we had made arrangements before we left to teach in the university. What had happened is that the Lithuanians had, through the diaspora, after the Soviets had become so repressive after the Nazis had, many Lithuanians left before the Second World War and came to Canada and Australia and the United States. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, many of them went back to recapture their home. They reconstituted a university that had been disbanded by the Soviets, and was at that university, Vytautas Magnus University, that is Vytautas the Great's university, that Ruth and I began to teach.